Hi, everyone. I'm Bill Squadron, President of Our Energy Policy, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on hydropower and America's energy mix. We have a terrific panel all set to go, and before we jump in, I just want to remind all of you that in the second part of the hour, we will be taking your questions. There is a questions tab on the dashboard on your right, and just type in your questions and we will get to as many as we possibly can throughout the course of the hour. I also want to especially thank our partners for supporting this series, which is now entering close to its 19th month of our webinar series, and we are very grateful to all of our partners and their commitment to our mission. Our objective is really to bring different voices together on all of the critical energy issues, to work with policymakers at the federal, state, local levels, support the media in really being able to provide thoughtful and a variety of perspectives on the difficult issues that we face, with the goal of really advancing sound energy policy for our country. And we are very grateful to all of our partners that you can see there for their support of our efforts. So our thanks to them. And of course, our thanks to all of you for joining us today. I encourage all of you to submit your questions. We're going to have a robust conversation on a critical part of the energy mix, which is hydropower. And we are really delighted to have Hydroquebec co-hosting this event with us, and our moderator, Pete Rose, the Director of Stakeholder Relations for Hydroquebec in New York, previously in government affairs for the government of Quebec in their New York office, one of the nation's leaders and experts on this topic. And so we're delighted to have Pete, who will introduce our panel and get the conversation going. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to him and our distinguished panel, and we'll go from there. Pete?
Sure. Thanks, Bill. Hi, everybody virtually. Hope everyone's doing well. Again, Bill, this is a really wonderful opportunity, and your whole crew over at Our Energy Policy is a wonderful team to work with. So kudos to you. I'm super excited today, frankly. I mean, I'm kind of jumping over Thanksgiving and getting right to Christmas. Discussing a topic that's near and dear to my heart, or two, I should say, clean energy and America. So, I'd like to just give a little bit of context on where we are in terms of hydropower here. In the United States, in 2020, 7% of our total U.S. utility scale electricity generation was from hydropower, which I believe is about 37% of the total renewable electricity generation in the U.S. All but 2 of the states in the United States, with the exception of Delaware and Mississippi, actually use hydropower for electricity, some more than others. Scott, one of the panelists, will be able to talk about that. I think at length. 74% of Washington State's power comes from hydropower, which is pretty remarkable. And so I guess, that makes hydropower almost as American as apple pie. So before I get off to introduce everybody to our amazing panelists, I definitely wanted to take a few seconds just to use my moderator soapbox to provide some real quick background on Hydroquebec. Hydroquebec is the largest producer of renewable energy in North America, with 37,000 megawatts of installed hydro capacity, 61 generating stations, and 20,000 miles of high voltage transmission. It generates, transmits, and distributes electricity to our customers in Quebec and exports clean power to our neighboring markets, including the Northeast of the United States. For over a century, New York and the states in New England have chosen our reliable and flexible renewable power to positively contribute to their economies, society, and to reducing carbon emissions. So we're very proud to be a partner in decarbonization as the Northeast region transitions to a cleaner energy economy and accelerates its efforts to address what most of us here on this panel, I can assume, believe is one of the most consequential issues of our time, which is climate change. And currently, we're working on 2 export projects to the United States. One is called the NECEC to deliver power to New England, and the other is called the Champlain Hudson Power Express that'll bring round-the-clock hydropower to New York City to help displace an abundance of fossil fuel generation, a bunch of which is located in disadvantaged frontline communities. So that's enough about me. I want to get off to the panelists. First off, I'll introduce Alicia Barton, She's the CEO of First Light Power. First Light Power is a New England-based company that operates a diversified electric generating portfolio, including hydroelectric pump storage, hydro battery storage, and solar. Then we have Pat Hoffman. She serves as Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Electricity at the U.S. Department of Energy. The Office of Electricity provides leadership to ensure that the nation's energy delivery system is secure, resilient, and reliable. And last but not least, Scott Corwin, Executive Director for the Northwest Public Power Association. NWPPA is a nonprofit association of over 155 public, people, utility, district, electric cooperatives, municipalities, and crown corporations in the Western US and Canada. So we're going to jump into the first question here, give a little bit of context. Natural gas prices are significantly high in the United States right now and probably will grow higher with a cold winter that's about to hit us. On Monday, the president signed a historic bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes investments to deliver reliable and clean power to more Americans. There's a push to get the Build Back Better Act passed before lawmakers go back home for holidays. Tomorrow, President Biden's set to meet in DC with the leaders of Mexico and Canada to discuss, among other issues, climate change. So my first question to the panelists will be, what is your read on the state of hydropower in America today, the good, the bad, and the ugly? And what should be its role going forward as the clean energy transition looks to shift up into high gear? I'll kick off the answers with Pat Hoffman from DOE.
So I'm going to check, can you hear me?
Yep.
I seem to be having some visibility issues, my apologies. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here and having this very important conversation on hydropower. I think hydropower is critical to the future and the flexibility of our nation's electricity infrastructure. One of the things that I want to point out, as it has been a long-standing resource for the United States, the world's first hydropower plant started in, I believe, Appleton, Wisconsin in 1882. And so it is a very important contribution to our electric portfolio. Everybody knows that it provides that flexibility from a resource point of view in helping us manage the variable generation, but also is just a long-standing important resource. But the challenges that we all see that we're going to talk about as part of this panel session today is the drought, the climate change that are affecting the hydropower assets in the United States, as well as the need to upgrade our infrastructure to really be able to take some of the aging infrastructure and upgrade it moving forward. So to chart a path forward, we really want to be able to say where we can environmentally sensitive areas, but expand the hydropower assets, recognizing the use of hydropower and the important needs, but also leverage the other resources that water provides in the United States. And then in addition to that is looking at upgrading our infrastructure writ large. There's huge opportunities in the United States to do that and build that capacity. And so I hope we are able to continue to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Pat. And can't see you, but we can hear you loud and clear. So appreciate your participation. I'll turn it over to Alicia now to answer the question.
Sure, and it's great to be here with you, Peter, Scott, and Pat, and everybody on the phone. And thanks for raising such a critically important topic. Obviously, one that's near and dear to my heart. From your introduction, Peter, highlighting, again, the substantial hydro portfolio that my company owns and operates here in New England. And I love that Pat brought up the kind of the history of hydropower. One thing that's not in our kind of standard company bio, we actually proudly own and operate the first pumped hydro storage facility in the United States. It's called Rocky River, and it is located in New Milford, Connecticut. It was completed in 1929. And we're obviously proud of that history, but I think it, highlights one of the big themes that I would raise in response to your question, which is, the role of hydropower is very much evolving as we think about, not the grid as we used to know it, but the grid that we will need to realize in order to meet our climate and decarbonization targets. And This has actually, I think, been a little bit of a personal evolution in thinking for me as well. I've spent all of my career advancing renewable energy projects. Primarily, though, wind, solar, and offshore wind is where a lot of my background has been in both my public sector and private sector past. And, you know, for many years, I think those of us on the clean energy advocacy side of things really focused like a laser on things being incremental and really looking at, you know, we only want to keep our focus on, you know, new resources and how do we build new resources. And that makes sense if you are targeting to get to that additional 10 or 20% on an RPS standard, right? You've got to focus your limited resources on incrementality and keep that priority. But when we moved in New York to a standard that requires a fully decarbonized grid by 2040, that really made me rethink how, you know, not only the role of hydropower, but other resources as well. But the mind shift that happens is it's not about how do we focus on the new stuff that we need to build, it's how do we look at the system we need in the future and work our way backward to what are the pieces, how do you fit them together, how will this work? And so in that light, I think hydropower looks different than it did to many of us in the past. And it's sort of, I think, the critical backbone to our decarbonization efforts. And that's both true of conventional hydro generation, which, you know, has in many cases, you know, high capacity factors, you know, has ponding capability, making it dispatchable. It has really attractive attributes as a renewable energy resource. We also have pumped hydro storage, which is significant to our efforts to integrate large-scale renewable energy into the grid at the scale that we are going to need. This looms large, of course, here in the Northeast in New York when we think about all the offshore wind that is going to need to come onto the grid. So it's sort of, again, hydro has a long-standing history of being, you know, one of our go-to resources for clean, affordable, reliable power. And when we look forward, that, you know, that necessity of maintaining and enhancing the role of hydro in the future puzzle pieces we will have to put together to get to a fully decarbonized grid, I think is one that looms large. And I'll stop there and we can come back to the challenges side of your question, but I think that's the good part of your good, bad, and the ugly.
No, thank you, Alicia. You're very humble too. I mean, for those that are joining in, Alicia was very pivotal in the offshore wind industry in New York, and clearly with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in New York, that is arguably the nation's leading climate and clean energy law. So fantastic. And, you know, to go back before I turn over to Scott, you brought up a very good point about decarbonization and the various technologies that are needed. You know, I'm sitting here in New York City, where we have upwards to almost 90% of our power in the city comes from fossil fuel generation. So it's extremely important to get as much renewable energy as we can get on the system, but actually also to get it down into New York City. So and other load pockets, you know, where it's needed for decarbonization. So later on in our discussion, I think I'd like to introduce the importance of transmission at some point. I think, you know, that'll probably be a very, very timely and helpful conversation to have in conjunction with hydropower. So Scott, turning it over to you on the West Coast.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I'm honored to be here too with Alicia and Pat and you. And great topic, one of my favorites also. You've already teed up a lot of really the important dynamics and aspects to hydropower. And yes, we sit a little differently here with such a large amount. Northwest Public Power Association, actually, that I represent now, has members though across a lot of the West, even beyond the hydropower-centric federal Columbia River power system. So we see hydropower in Alaska, obviously Northern California. We have some members in Canada even. And, you know, it's just the current state, to your question, you know, strong, but becoming more and more needed and relevant relative to these policy priorities and goals and customer needs. And operational demands every day. You know, we start, especially in the immediate Northwest, with, as you noted, you know, a state like Washington, 75% across the Bonneville Power Administration portfolio for those customers. it's more like 87% of their portfolio is just hydropower. And actually balanced across that whole 4-state region, it's about 57%. So we start with quite a bit there base load, but as Alyssa noted, the importance now increasingly is just that incredible value from a capacity standpoint, both for reliability, for integrating other intermittent resources. It's important to help meet some of these kind of conflicting priorities and policy that we have. And I think looking forward, I just note too, I think it was noted earlier in the questions, we have this leaders summit today and, or tomorrow meeting for the Western Hemisphere here. So that interaction with Canada, especially in our area, but I think across the northern United States is a really important part of this. And they've got a lot of potential there. And I think hopefully that'll be top of mind in those discussions, because it meets priorities for both countries to collaborate better, coordinate better, and facilitate this exchange, especially with respect to hydropower resources. So maybe I'll stop there, except to say moving forward, we'll get to some of these issues you noted, but the potential, you noted 7% in the United States. The really interesting out of some of those earlier studies that we saw is you only have about 3% of the total hydropower projects with generation on them. And you think, how could that be? Well, there's about 80,000 of them, a lot of them very small, and so not all necessarily desirable for generation, but with proper regulatory process, new technology, market designs and transmission to support that, there is a lot of potential, and we'll see where we can take it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. So clearly we're all supporters of hydropower, and it would make sense to use more of it, but there was a study done by the DOE a few years ago about the potential to increase the amount of hydropower electricity that we get into the system, and we haven't necessarily seen that materialize. So the fact that we see its value, and I'll start with Alicia on this one. What are the issues or forces that are potentially hindering investments in the area of hydropower?
Yeah, there are a lot, unfortunately, and I think that's part of the reason why you haven't seen the growth kind of meet some of the academic potential for the resource that's out there. And what I worry about more, frankly, is an eroding baseline of hydropower, which again, we absolutely need to form that, again, the kind of the base of our building blocks to get to a fully decarbonized grid. And any loss is going to be steps backward when we are on a timeline where we cannot afford any steps backward. So the reasons for that are, going to be different depending on the region, on the project. I can speak, maybe a little bit, it's helpful to people as, again, an owner operator of 14 different hydro facilities at my company, ranging from quite small to extremely large. Our largest asset is nearly 1,200 megawatts. So again, that's larger than most offshore wind farms, actually. And so, but each of those projects, large and small, face relatively high capital costs and reinvestment. Again, these are physical assets that are wet by definition and go through a lot of wear and tear, and you do need periodic capital reinvestment. We do have operators for most of our older stations. Newer stations may have more advanced technology to do better remote operation, but a lot of hydropower assets around the country are old and do have, again, high operating costs compared to, for example, a solar plant. But again, we need the attributes of the resource. We also do have, we continue to face challenges in terms of opposition from environmental advocates that that don't prefer hydropower, and in terms of perceived impacts on aquatic environment or fish passage and the like. And again, that's going to be very, very site specific, but it is a real factor that I think at times creates a global headwind for the hydropower industry, because we need environmental advocates who are forcefully vocal in advancing all climate solutions. We've made some progress on that. I want to point out that the National Hydro Association, as well as leading environmental organizations, particularly American Rivers, but others as well, have come together to try and bridge some of that historic gap around the environmental opposition to hydropower. It's been called the Uncommon Dialogue and was led out of Stanford. And what that resulted in actually was a number of productive conversations, but also joint lobbying in favor of a specific new investment tax credit that would go towards upgrades for environmental measures and dam safety measures at existing hydropower facilities. That's the kind of signal that we are going to need to send if we're going to see hydropower advance beyond our current baseline, and again, maintain that baseline of installed capacity today. There's a lot of topics around the relicensing process as well. That is expensive, challenging, and time consuming for everyone involved. And there are, again, efforts underway, to streamline that. And I want to say, and it's really again an honor to be here with Pat and the great work that the Biden administration is doing. They have included major provisions for grants for hydropower. I won't step on Pat's talking points on that, but in the infrastructure bill that was signed just this week, and I guess I would say on behalf of the hydropower industry, those are the kinds of tangible support signals, public policy signals that we are going to need to see if we're going to make progress leveraging the incredible potential that hydro has.
That's a perfect segue to Pat, and also maybe she'll touch on if we get the Build Back Better Act through before the end of session. Potentially, there's some provisions in there that could also be helpful for hydropower. So I'll turn the same question over to you, Pat. What are issues or forces that are hindering investment in the area of hydropower?
So thank you, and I think it's a really important question and a great dialogue that was started on this topic. From the challenges point of view, I think you've heard already some of the challenges that the industry is experiencing, whether it's the permitting issues, the licensing issues. I'm not going to go through some of those issues, but I think on the permitting side of things, we really need to think about how we collectively can advance and accelerate permitting in the United States for energy infrastructure moving forward. And I think that we have to think about how do we really collectively look at our ability to really understand the value of land use planning, the resources, and our process for permitting, which really requires a partnership in the federal area, but also in the state area around the permitting agencies and who have federal actions around federal permitting. Other challenges is really just the use of water and looking at just the multi-purpose or the multi-use water in the United States. And I think we have to really do a better job of continuing to educate the value that hydropower brings from a power production side, and to the earlier points that the presenters have made in the critical importance that it has to electricity production, but also managing the flexibility that the electricity system is going to need moving forward, specifically as we continue to achieve the clean energy goals by the Biden administration, and really looking at 100% clean by 2035 and net zero by 2050. With respect to the infrastructure bill, look, this is a great opportunity. There is over $700 million in the infrastructure bill, the bipartisan infrastructure deal. It's also called IIJA. But really what that does is it goes after investing in that infrastructure, and some of the comments that I made earlier about how we need to upgrade the infrastructure and the facilities in the United States, but also look at opportunities where we can support increased capacity, new technology. And so those are huge opportunities in walking through each of the provisions on how we can actually take advantage of those resources and the funding that's available to get more capacity out of the system and to really provide additional support to pump storage, hydropower, and the opportunities it brings. And so with that, I think there is a great way to invest in our infrastructure at this point in time and really increase some of the capacity that's out there. As was discussed, there is the run of the river, for electricity production, but then there is pump storage, hydropower. And both of those can be utilized and needed in the United States. The flexibility that pump storage brings, though, really, I can't say it enough, that's critical to the importance of our electric infrastructure moving forward. With respect to the reconciliation bill, I think there is a lot of opportunities out there. I hope that Congress is able to really focus on that and get that across the finish line, and then we'll see what happens and what's actually appropriated from there. So thank you.
That's fantastic. And my understanding is the president was out in New England I guess yesterday, promoting the infrastructure bill. There's going to be a tour. I've heard maybe there's like 1,000 visits that are going to be done by members of the cabinet and other. Maybe I'll just put a plug out there to get up to some of Alicia's installations and up where Scott is as well, because they're critically important. For the country.
we would certainly welcome any visitors. And I just wanted to note on the Build Back Better, and of course there's a lot in there that would be a tremendous advancement for all kinds of clean energy resources. So I hope and expect that will be able to come together at some point. The provision I mentioned a minute ago actually is not in the version that came out of the House. We have heard there's some support for it in the Senate. So I did want to actually just make a plug for including, again, that new 30% ITC that specifically would go towards environmental and dam safety upgrades. This would be a new credit. There are existing hydropower tax credits that focused on the generation side, and those are proposed to be extended, which is critically important. And there's new ITC for pumped hydro development, critically important. So again, there's tons of great stuff in there, but I'd also put a plug, and hopefully we'll see Senator Wyden and others carry the ball forward to get this additional provision included in what ultimately, hopefully, will reach the president's desk. Excellent.
And now shifting over to Scott, based on your opening remarks, 74% or 75% of electricity in Washington State comes from hydro. So clearly there's interest and investment, but are you seeing any other issues where you are in the part of the country in terms of investment?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we have, there's the list of challenges, but I guess to follow on the discussion we were just having, though, when you look at incentives for investment and also just policy mandates or priorities, I think, part of it is choosing between resources over time to meet your state renewable portfolio standards. Well, you're seeing a little bit of a move, and Alyssa just mentioned Senator Wyden, and with Northwest senators now, particularly to try to build in a more technology neutral set of incentives and approach. And I would say also from our standpoint, we have a lot of public power, consumer-owned power in the West. To have that also be business model neutral is important. So tax incentives aren't working, a traditional tax incentive or credit isn't nearly as usable when you're tax exempt to start with. So having direct pay options as part of that's really important. And hopefully we'll see progress on that in the Build Back, the next act. But even in the one just passed, as noted, some really helpful steps, both in funding and also in our area for the Bonneville Power Administration, borrowing authority, and WAPA as well. So there, that's really a helpful movement on those sides. I think importantly, Pat mentioned permitting. So especially out here where you have a lot of rural area where these are going into areas that are on federal lands, a lot of environmental issues and permitting that can really stretch out the time on this. And obviously for folks trying to get projects done to meet load or to meet resource adequacy issues, that timeline needs to be tightened quite a bit, and you can see the areas where we can improve on that at the federal, state, and local level. So that's, yeah, I'd start there, and then there's other issues under that I think we might get to. So.
Sure, excellent. And to build off of this, I started earlier in the conversation where obviously we're getting renewables. There's parts of the country where there's more potential for renewables than others. Clearly, we have hydropower, which is an important resource, but we need the infrastructure, the transmission to actually get the power where it's most needed. From your perspectives, how can we help move that along? I mean, we're seeing a number of infrastructure projects that are not advancing or having troubles advancing, where you would suspect that there's a need for the energy, but it gets caught up in kind of the transmission portion of it. I guess I could start with Pat if she has any thoughts about that on the transmission side of the equation.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I'm going to go back to some of the earlier comments that some of the other speakers made just to set the stage, and that is we need to think collectively with investing in our electricity and energy infrastructure holistic from a generation point of view, from a transmission point of view, and a delivery point of view. As we look at opportunities on the customer side with electric vehicles, we're going to see a growth in electricity demand. And we need to make sure that our infrastructure keeps pace with that growth so that we actually can continue to provide the reliable services and better be able to manage some of those extreme events. We'll probably get to talk about the polar vortex and some of the other events and contingencies that we need to think about. But now that you've brought up the conversation, we do have to continue to educate for the need for transmission. And we're going to have to expand the transmission capacity in the United States. And so that's really looking at upgrading the existing structure, transmission infrastructure, whether it's reconductoring, whether it's adding upgrades from a voltage level, but really looking at how can we expand the existing capacity. And then it is getting, I will say, a consensus, but a path forward that everybody understands these are the critical transmission investments moving forward. So states can look at their land use planning, partner with energy developers and the transmission developers for getting transmission built. The 10-year timeline is way too long for getting transmission built. We have to find a way to really take a hard look at some of these difficult issues around NIMBYism and transmission, but I would still say goes for pump storage, hydropower, and other assets moving forward. And how do we get the infrastructure built in a timely fashion and keeps pace? Developers, from wind and solar can really develop projects a lot faster, but if we can't get those projects to the market and allow them to participate in the market, we are going to be challenged moving forward. So we have to continue our focus. So what does that mean? It really means states need to be engaged in the transmission planning process. We really need to look at scenarios and have the political leaderships when the state and the federal government really understand those scenarios, but also the infrastructure required to meet those scenarios from a clean energy portfolio point of view. Then actually roll up our sleeves with respect to land use planning, certificates for public needs, and all the requirements around getting transmission infrastructure built in the United States. But I would say it's not only transmission infrastructure, it still goes back to whether it's pump storage or energy storage writ large. We have to continue to invest in the whole portfolio of technologies. I'll pause there, but that is a passion of mine.
I can hear the passion in your voice. I appreciate that. Scott, you have any thoughts on transmission?
Yeah, well, obviously yeah, I agree, and it's an important focus tied to making sure that your market structures are in place to appropriately reward and incentivize the qualities that hydropower has. So, you know, the ability to move it's one thing, the ability to properly value it is another part that's an important part of that equation. And you look at it in the West where we are, you know, we have West-wide reliability coordination. We're working towards broader resource adequacy programs, but you know, it's not yet a comprehensive model. So it takes a lot of work, a lot of coordination on the transmission planning side to make the pieces fit. But it's increasingly important, and linking that into hydropower is it's a great question, right? Because you can see the potential to, and we have for quite a while, to address some of the biggest challenges, like the California ISO for several years have been putting out the curve, you know, the famous duck curve, famous out here anyway in our world, showing what happens to net load in the evening when your solar fleet comes off and your the loads are going up through cooling and all the other uses, including plugging in your EV and other pieces that are important to that equation. So, you know, hydropower it's right there with the ability to ramp, and what other non-emitting resource can do that for you. Maybe eventually small modular nuclear and some other pieces can ramp like that, but right now, for reliability on that, it's hydro, and having the transmission to get it there to meet these constraints is critical. So, yeah. So yeah, some good movements in these bills on that, including, I don't know if you're going to talk later about the Canadian connection on that. Senator Cantwell out here from Washington's had a focus on that helpfully to try to also create a little more capability west-wide and focus on pump storage as well. So.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely get to our friends in Canada before the end of this. Alicia, you're uniquely positioned in the sense that you obviously working now in New England. You have a long history of working in New York. You've kind of seen this play out. New York State has accelerated siting for renewables and for transmission. And hopefully that is going to make it a little bit of an easier process in New York State, at least. Do you see a role for any specific agency at the federal level to help kind of move these projects along if they get caught up?
It's such a hard question. You know, in the siting opposition to transmission, but also to other renewables, it is one that definitely keeps me up at night. I'm super optimistic about our ability to innovate and deliver cost-effective clean energy solutions that will reliably power our electric grid on a 100% basis, even as that electric grid becomes more critical as we decarbonize transportation and buildings. But when I think about where will we stumble on our path to that, you know, I do think the siting pushback issues are going to be, you know, probably at or maybe possibly the top of the list, unfortunately. That is why New York passed a new law to reform the way energy siting is done in the state, and it's early days for that, but I think there are some good signs of success and progress already. That's not going to be one size fits all for every state, every region, and certainly at the federal level. Very difficult to, you know, for the federal government, who has in some cases limited authority over the direct siting. I do think there are, you know, some things that could and should be done though, and I haven't seen a ton of discussion about this from, you know, some of the Biden priorities. So I'd encourage, you know, some of our colleagues in the federal government to think about options. But, you know, essentially, you know, there is, you know, obviously the NEPA tool and the NEPA process that comes to bear. And I think, you know, and that flows through all kinds of other permitting decisions we could take, you know, hydropower relicensing at FERC, for example. Those tend to look at impacts, and I don't, you know, doesn't really have like a natural mechanism that has been used to date to also look at benefits and to try and put the impacts of development on a better footing of what are the environmental climate benefits of such a project at the same time. It's something, you know, we're going through relicensing on our largest assets, and we are, you know, I think really trying to advocate for injecting some perspective on, as we look at how to mitigate environmental impacts and what the costs of those mitigation measures are. Also, you know, what are the benefits that we are getting from these assets to begin with in terms of avoided emissions and climate impacts. And that's something that, again, I think is not, you know, a really mature concept, but, you know, could have some promise. The harder part is just is people. People don't like new stuff being built, unfortunately, like as an overgeneralization, but, you know, whether that's, you know, a new subdivision or a new power plant or a new transmission line, you know, we just see everywhere opposition to new large infrastructure. And that does get to the broader infrastructure effort that the president and Congress have signed off on as well. Easier to do upgrades, I think, you know, than new development. And I wish I had, Peter, you know, a better answer for how we sort of win the hearts and minds aspect of, you know, citing necessary large scale climate infrastructure like transmission or new renewable energy generation. It's, you know, it's gonna take a collective effort from all of us to continue that education process and to look at, you know, what are our alternatives in some cases. So, you know, in the case of opposition to transmission lines that, you know, that you've brought up, and of course there's been some high profile news around that here in New England. It is very much the case that the alternative is, you know, existing or increased, you know, fossil generation. And, you know, I think it can be hard to really get people to digest the reality of that. So we clearly have a long way to go is all I can really say on that, unfortunately. But, you know, that's the work that we will do as an industry, as an environmental advocacy community, and for those of us that are committed to fighting climate change and building solutions, we're gonna keep at it.
Perfect. Yeah, you kind of segued into what my next question was going to be. If anybody wants to jump on it, is there are misconceptions and misinformation about hydropower and its value for American renewable energy and for the clean economy. And so as an industry, I know, Alicia, you're doing it, Scott, you're doing it, Pat, obviously from a government perspective, but education's the way to go. But is there any way that we can, is there anything else we could be doing as stakeholders to best address some of these misconceptions or misinformation and bust some of the myths? Is there any stone that we're not, you know, leaving unturned? And anybody can jump in on this. I don't know.
So Peter, if I can start, I apologize for jumping in on folks. I think there is a couple things that we need to continue to educate on and look at. And it comes to a point that Scott started with, was that hydropower has capacity and energy. And I think consumers only really think about the energy component, and we need to really think about how to demonstrate and have markets, in addition, value the capacity in addition to the energy that hydropower presents. And it is such a flexible resource, and the need for having generation in the United States that has that flexibility is absolutely critical from that perspective. And to Alicia's point, I don't know how we win the hearts and minds of folks, because hydropower can be a resource, pump storage, from the perspective that it really provides benefits to communities, whether it's water, you know, management, flood control. And so having that collective message of all the services it provides and how clean it is really makes it a very attractive resource, though we still struggle with getting that message across. So I'll stop there.
Apologies to jump in here. This is Kevin, Program Director with Our Energy Policy. We do want to transition to QA just so we have enough time to get through all the questions that have come in. Fascinating discussion so far. First question here is from Jeff Hubbs. Could panelists expand on the status situation regarding replacement of existing hydro plant generators with newer technology? Is it worth doing?
Alicia or Scott, either one of you would jump in there?
Yeah, why don't you? Okay, thanks. I'll start and then I'll let you. You're actually doing it, I'm sure, but I've overseen a lot of those initiatives out here, and the question, and actually it's part of the answer to the prior question about, the misconceptions about hydropower is there's really no one size fits all, right? So you have older, larger kind of resource of the past, views of hydropower, but you have everything from that all the way up to, pilots on tidal and wave and new pump storage and old pump storage. So the short answer is it depends on some of the larger projects out here. For example, it's clearly worth it from a business case standpoint because they're large enough megawatts. You already have all of the environmental pieces lined up for mitigation on them. You've got hundreds of millions of investment in them. So upgrading for a fish friendlier turbine or doing the rewinding some pieces, absolutely worth it. And they've done it at some of the larger projects, including Grand Coulee Dam, for example. But at some of the others where smaller pieces, smaller megawatts with larger environmental mitigation costs as well, without great transmission that would need to be upgraded as well, doesn't necessarily pencil out. So it really depends. But I'm sure Alicia's got live examples right now. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think Scott's exactly right. It's just not one size fits all, and it may be that there are assets that would be worth retiring, either for environmental reasons or really because they're uneconomic and don't look to be economic looking ahead. But I think that the way that I think about it more frequently and what we're working on at First Light is how do we leverage that built infrastructure to the highest and best possible value for the grid or our customers. And we operate both in the wholesale markets and bilaterally with direct customers. So we're looking at many of our hydro sites, building out additional solar capacity and adding batteries to those same sites. As Scott just alluded to, we're already ideally connected, particularly for our assets. Our assets, a lot of them are older. They're part of the hydro build out that happened around the Industrial Revolution in New England that was powering, our entire economy here in New England. And so the electric grid in many cases was built around older assets like that. So we're very well sited in proximity to transmission and in even large scale transmission in many cases, depending on our assets. And again, that's for a reason. And so you look at that and say, well, this is a great place to do more, to add more clean electrons, again, in the form of potentially adding solar co-located with our hydro sites on land nearby, or even, again, boosting the value of that production of hydro plus solar by adding batteries that make the hydro even more flexible and valuable to the grid than it was previously. So that's, I think, less, and again, because as I alluded to before, I really worry about taking steps backwards on installed capacity, because the bar we've set for ourselves and the New York State goals, the federal administration goals is so high. We really can't afford to lose much in terms of installed clean generation today. And we've got to look again to building and leveraging. And so that's how I get around the either or, I think, is, kind of making these things work together. And at least that's what we're trying to deliver for our customers at First Light.
Perfect. Kevin, you got another question?
I do. We've had a couple of questions come in regarding methane, so I'll paraphrase a little bit. Questions from Jacqueline Dreschler and Jack Lunard. How is the industry addressing emissions from methane emissions, and particularly in water impoundments? And let's grow that to greenhouse gases in general.
Do we have anybody want to jump on that question?
Well, I mean, out here, it's interesting. Again, it depends on the project on whether there's an identified issue, because without impoundment, with just a run of the river project, I'm not sure how much they've identified. I guess if there's fluctuations seasonally, they might. In storage projects, there's a lot, there's been a lot of discussion on it. I'm not sure, Pat may know how, if the PMA, the Power Marketing Institutes, have done other studies on the actual impact, but it's still been an evolving issue. And it's interesting, some of our hydropower utilities relying on hydropower are where it's more directly identifiable from a source perspective and capturable. For example, landfill methane, they are capturing it, and not just generating now, but some of them are using it actually to sort of upgrade the gas and actually put it in as a renewable natural gas into the gas pipeline as well. So that's a big evolution in methane out at some of our larger landfill plants. But at the storage projects, I'm not sure what the approach is quite yet coming out of some of those studies.
I mean, I can speak just for Hydroquebec in the sense that northern, so where our impoundments are, where the reservoirs are, is a northern climate. So vegetation very sparse up there, which means that we're not getting kind of methane issues that you might be getting from other reservoirs. I think maybe some of the tropical areas would be much different than what we're seeing where we are. Cold water also contains more dissolved oxygen than warm water, so you don't have this methane buildup and gassing. So on the GHG side of things, hydropower, again, we did a 100-year study of the reservoirs up in Hydroquebec, and our greenhouse gas emissions came out on par with wind, for example. Yeah, there's going to be some greenhouse gases in any technology when you're actually building it, but such a long lifetime of a hydro facility, and with refurbishments and repowering, it's almost eternal in the sense that you're just going to keep once you have that asset built, you're going to keep upgrading it. That again, it's on par. So after a certain amount of time, those initial greenhouse gas emissions have been have lowered.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. We had a couple questions come in as well regarding just changing climate. I'm wondering if the panelists could speak a little bit about, ways the industry is preparing or has prepared to handle too much or not enough precipitation within the system.
Well, what we're seeing is it's already on us, right? And the volatility's been there for a while. And it's not a new, from that perspective, not a new issue from a hydro planner outlook, because if you go back 100 years, you've got quite a range of water years within that. We've got but it's even tougher dynamic now where you have a lot of several years linked with lower snowfall, with higher temperatures. Because in our system, some of our systems out here, especially the larger federal system, you have sort of a double storage value, which is really nice, right? You've got it in snowpack. An ideal year, you have big, heavy snowpack early, and it comes off gradually. But there is no average year, right? There's low years and there's high years, and sometimes they get close to average, but they average out. And then you have storage in the reservoirs that you try to use. Well, when your reservoirs are all the way down, like in Northern California, like there were this year, a huge challenge. And so what they've tried to do a lot more of is, first of all, better modeling, better, so to try to get out ahead of that, better use of the storage over time, partnerships, again, with Canada and others. It's important for fish mitigation as well. And just try to do better season to season planning. But important to that also is the balance, the other issues we brought up. Do you have the transmission capacity to fill in where your storage isn't there for you in that year, to bring the other resources to bear, and at what emissions rate or those other resources coming into your portfolio. So there's a lot of work that's been done to try to get out ahead of that with meteorologists here and with modeling on it, and then building that into the operational plan, season to season, year to year, and then right in week to week and into real time. So.
Alicia, you have, did you want to make a comment? I thought I saw
I'll
you.
just be very brief. You know, it's interesting. It's a very different dynamic in the East than it is in the West. So that I just wanted to sensitize, you know, listeners to that. The predictions for the Northeast and up through Canada, where HQ's assets are, is really for increased rainfall due to the changing climate. We'll see if that materializes, and of course it will be unpredictable. We have already seen, you know, again in the Northeast, even just the state of New York has lived through, you know, many 100-year storms in the last decade, you know, probably 5 or 6. So it's, you know, that creates its own challenges, obviously, in water management. So it's something that we, you know, we do have to do our best to navigate. And I don't know that I think the East, those of us on the East Coast are, you know, probably less far along in thinking about some of the adaptation to climate change, because we have, although we have had these storms that have been extreme, we have not been living with it as consistently as some in the West are. So I'd say, to me, it's like a needs area for, you know, the industry and government and others to come together and continue to think forward on that.
Yeah,
I'd probably add one other too, Peter. You know, so one impact has been in our recent years just obviously, as you've seen, a real increase in wildfires as well, out of the droughts and the heat. Has an impact on hydro too. So trying to get, aside from just the shape of the runoff, then you have landslides, sedimentation coming into some of your hydro systems as well, in addition to impacts to the transmission system. So part of the planning also goes right back to things that Pat and Alicia raised before on ability within the NEPA and other constraints to rebuild quickly, to retain that system capability for hydro from some of these effects of extreme weather coming out of the recent climate. So.
Perfect.
And
Yeah.
Peter, I can add to the conversation real quick. Two things is, not only is the important to have better model with respect to whether you're going to have a heavy rainy season or drought conditions, but the other aspect is the availability of the resource for grid operators to make sure they understand any potential constraints with respect to whether you have to run for fish protection, or you have to think about your operating parameters from a flexibility point of view in managing system reliability. So it is a whole coordination of modeling and understanding of what we need to prepare for in the future. That's an important aspect of how we should develop this.
Yeah, I agree. And just on the Quebec, since we were speaking about the Northeast, and I agree with Alicia, what we've seen out in terms of modeling is actually more rainfall and more precipitation. And so it's not the same across the continent, clearly, as Scott has experiencing some different situations out west. But and it's also about kind of how we manage our system. Quebec has such a vast system, and it's over such a vast territory. Quebec is 2.5 times the size of Texas. So if we could just give perspective on how big the actual province is. And so weather patterns are different throughout the province as well. And you have a whole network of reservoirs. You have, 28 reservoirs and 61 generating stations that all work together. We're very conservative. We keep at least a year's worth of our capacity in our reservoirs. So we don't have any issue in terms of levels or precipitation at this current time.
So I'm sorry to have to jump in here, because this has been such a phenomenal conversation with great insights about such an important part of the energy mix, which I think has become patently clear. And I want to thank all of you, Scott, Alicia, Pat, and Pete, for conducting this conversation. Such a critical topic. We're clearly going to do more on this topic at Our Energy Policy as we go forward. I want to thank all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate it. We'd like to encourage you to use the Our Energy Library, which is on the OEP website. It is a very comprehensive resource library for reports, studies, papers, and so forth on hydropower and all other issues around energy that you may be working on. And we'd encourage you to use it. It's really as complete a repository of energy materials as I think you can find anywhere on the planet and online, which I guess at this point is pretty much the same thing. So we are out of time, unfortunately, but we look forward to seeing you again soon at another event. Thank you very much for your support. Thanks again to our partners, to our co-host Hydroquebec, to all of our panelists and moderator, and to all of you for joining us today. So have a great rest of the week, and we wish you a great Thanksgiving next week. Goodbye.
Right.
Thank you. Wonderful
you.
conversation.
Thank you.